welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Turn the Page podcast from Syosset Public Library. I am here with my amazing, illustrious co-host. Please introduce yourself.
Oh my goodness, thank you. Hello, I'm Jen.
And we are here with the author of 3 wonderful books. The most recent one is the third, which we will be talking about. Also, please excuse me, I am very caffeinated at the moment. And last night was the 4th of July here in the States, and I was up all night because people were blowing things up in front of my house. So if you live in the States, you get how that is. If you don't live in the States, just be happy that you probably got a better night's sleep than I did last night.
Oh, no.
So welcome. Please introduce yourself and tell us about Heads Will Roll.
Hi, I'm Josh Winning. I'm really happy to be back on the podcast with you guys. I love this show. I love chatting with you, so thank you. So I'm the author of The Shadow Glass, Burn the Negative, and then this year I have Heads Will Roll, hitting shelves. And it's sort of like a modern day reinterpretation of Friday the 13th, which is one of my absolute favorite slasher films. And the premise is basically that there's a sitcom star. She gets cancelled for something that she tweeted, and her life basically falls apart. Her career, she gets fired off her show, which is called We Love Willow. Her fiance leaves her. He tells her to get out the house. And so she goes off to a digital detox camp in order to escape the very public humiliation of what has happened. But when she gets to camp, she discovers that actually everybody there has been cancelled or publicly shamed in some way. And somebody else there basically would like to cancel them for good. And yeah, so that's like the, in a nutshell, sort of summation of the book.
I would love if we could start out by talking a little bit about Willow, sort of crafting her character and her situation. Because I feel like with her cancellation, you are threading a very nuanced, difficult, delicate needle, because you need to empathize with her and not think she's a terrible person, but you also need to understand that there is nuance in being canceled. So could you talk about crafting her and her situation and how you try to walk that line?
Yeah, there's that very first draft of this book. I didn't actually reveal what she tweeted that got her into such hot water. And my sort of rationale for that was that certain people have been cancelled or publicly shamed or, raked over the coals online for seemingly, it's almost irrelevant what they've done. It's like they get judged very broadly by a lot of people for a perceived wrong. And it's not necessarily important what they even said or what they did. It's more about just getting this person, like exposing this person for the horrible stuff that they've done, kind of things. So my rationale for not revealing what Willow actually tweeted was that. But my early readers sort of like spent the whole book basically desperately waiting for me to reveal what she had tweeted. And of course I didn't in that draft. And they were really upset about it. And more importantly, they felt that they couldn't actually get on board with Willow as a character because they felt uncomfortable in rooting for a character who may have done something so unspeakable that we don't even reveal what it was. So I went away and I went back to the drawing board and really had to think about what is it that she could have tweeted that could have been misconstrued, picked up by sort of a very militant social media going public, and turned against her in a way that was just so catastrophic that it ruined her life and her career. And so, yeah, I kind of threaded that throughout the book. And then at the midpoint of the book, we do discover what she tweeted. And it's for the audience to decide if she warranted the so-called cancellation that she received. So, yeah, she was a tough character to get into, actually, because I don't know, I found I was throwing too many things initially at her. I was giving her too many issues, too many things to deal with. My editor, Aranya Jain at Putnam, she's fantastic. And she really helped me to pare it back to the bare essentials and just keep the main ingredients of Willow. And the thing that we came across during the writing was this idea that Willow is actually a horror fan but she's somehow wound up living this sitcom existence where she's kind of a bit of a fraud, like a bit of a fake. And she's living this life that she's not comfortable with. It doesn't feel authentic to who she is. And she kind of she's wanted to escape it forever, but didn't really know how. And so the cancellation that occurs kind of weirdly frees her and gives her sort of a blank slate to start out again. So the book is very much about her rediscovering who she is, away from the public eye, away from this public persona that she's so fastidiously crafted for herself. And yeah, away from this sort of sitcom life that she's fallen into. And then we kind of figure out why she did that essentially over the course of the book. Sorry, that was a very long-winded response to a very lovely question.
No, it was excellent. And I will say one of the things I did like most about the book was that I was not sure how reliable of a narrator Willow was in the beginning. And I wasn't sure if I liked her. And it took a while. It really, really did. I did very much appreciate, though, who she was and the fact that she was sort of this cutesy, bright Netflix star who really just wanted to cut her hair and watch Evil Dead, and I loved it. I totally do wonder how many celebrities are sort of, I guess, when you think about their image and how that becomes a brand. You mentioned this a little bit in the book, like her haircut became a brand. She talks a little bit, I believe, about the haircut that Courtney Cox had in the early aughts with, I don't remember what Scream that was, but one of the Screams. And then when you think about Courtney Cox, obviously you have to think about Jennifer Aniston, who I would hear these rumors that like her hair was insured for a ridiculous amount of money. But it is true that you do become a brand aside from yourself, it seems like, if you do get this hit show and you're not supposed to be doing anything that seems to, I guess, subvert what the image is. So, which is why I thought it was interesting that when Willow gets to camp, Willow is not her real name. But when she gets there, she chooses that as her camp name because everybody in camp chooses a different name. So that was very interesting to me. I do have a question about summer camp. So a while back, we had actually interviewed Riley Sager about The Last Time I Lied, which also
Love that book.
Such a good book. It's actually one of my favorites and made me temporarily obsessed with Drowned Towns, which if you have not read that book, read that book and then look up Drowned Towns if you don't know what they are. It's very interesting. But anyway, we interviewed Riley Sager about The Last Time I Lied. And what he said was that that one did very poorly overseas because summer camps were just not a big thing over there. So clearly, Josh, you do not live in the States.
No, I live a very long way away.
But you did say that Friday the 13th was an inspiration for this book. And I loved it because I didn't pick up on that until much later. It was so well woven into it. So are summer camps really a purely American experience? And do people overseas experience them through media specifically?
Yeah, I can't speak for the world as a whole, but definitely in the UK, we don't really have summer camps. We don't really ship our kids off to spend weeks and weeks in the wilderness in these sort of like, I mean, to me, they look idyllic, these like idyllic lakeside camps, just that to us, I don't know, it's just a completely different culture, I guess, over here. We would maybe go to a resort as a family, maybe a bit more like Dirty Dancing. So you go away as a family, and then maybe the kids would sort of go off for like daily activities, but they would definitely not be sent off alone to a camp. So that in itself feels like faintly sinister from a British perspective. We only really experience summer camps. Well, I think there's two ways. The first way is through the media, as you said. So films like Friday the 13th, films like The Parent Trap, Addams Family Values, when Wednesday and Pugsy get sent off to Camp Chippewa.
The best movie ever.
Yes. I could not agree more completely. So yeah, through movies like that, but also we do have people who do summer camp as counselors. So I have one of my oldest friends after he finished, was it before university? I can't remember, but he basically went over to do Camp America for one summer where he worked on a summer camp. So if I'd been smart and remembered that, I probably should have actually spoken to him before I wrote this book to kind of get all the ins and outs. But instead, I just went on lots of websites and just looked at all the different stuff that you do at summer camps, and they look amazing. My only real experience of camping in that way as a kid was when I was a beaver. So I think you guys have Boy Scouts, we have beavers, which is just faintly ridiculous. And I got sent, it was pathetic. It was for one night in a park and we camped, and I got homesick and I hated it and I hated every second of it. And it was only when I was older, like a couple of years later, that I discovered the park that we'd stayed in was, I'm going to say, less than a mile from our house. So all of this anxiety that I felt of being alone in the dark in this park, it was in the middle of a town a mile from my house. Yeah, summer camps, not a thing in England.
I would love if we could talk a little bit about, without giving too much away, honestly, I want to preserve your secrets and some surprises for the readers. Knock Knock Nancy. And my question in particular is about, how do you build an urban legend from scratch? Because it has to feel lived in and old, like it sort of has acquired the weight of history and oral tradition of being told from a generation of camper to camper. So could you talk a little bit about what you think are like the ingredients that go into like a perfect urban legend?
Oh, wow, that's really good. That's a really good question. So one of my favorite films is Urban Legend, which is a 90s slasher film that is obviously all about these kinds of urban myths. I suppose they've got to be like snappy. They've got to be quick and snappy to understand. They've got to have some kind of moralistic undertone to them. So some kind of lesson that you might learn. It's like when Robert England is doing his seminar on urban legends in Urban Legend, he talks about the socio-economic lesson that you can learn from the babysitters in the house, that kind of phone calls coming from inside the house. And he's like, the lesson is mind your children or harm will come to them. That's the lesson there. So yeah, I think that's probably the big one. And then, you've got to have something a bit gory, a bit horrible going on, a bit of a twist maybe. With mine, I actually didn't really set out to tell much of an urban legend in Heads Will Roll. It was definitely something that evolved organically over the course of redrafting. So I had a version of the story of Knock Knock Nancy very early on in drafting, but she didn't really come to the fore until I was in maybe draft 2 or 3, and I started to think about interesting ways to bring her story back into reality. So she's become this myth. I should probably explain what the myth is. So the story of Knock Knock Nancy is that Nancy was a young maid living in a village, and she finds an injured preacher in the woods, and so she takes him back to her house to nurture him back to health. And when the preacher recovers, he goes into town and discovers that actually the locals all hate Nancy because they believe that she's a witch. And he is a man of the cloth, and he's very upset about the fact that he's been treated by a witch using all her lotions and potions. So he goes to confront her, and he finds her chopping logs outside her house. And he demands that she, forsake Satan and embrace God and all this kind of stuff. And she refuses. And so he chops her head off. Well, before he chops her head off, he chases her through the town. It's been a while since I read this book. He chases her through the town, and she's knocking on all the doors, desperately trying to escape, desperate for help from the locals, but nobody answers her cries for help. And the next morning, they find her body in the town fountain, and her head is nowhere to be seen. And so the myth is that in the middle of the night, if you hear a knock on your door, don't answer the door, because it's probably going to be Knock Knock Nancy coming to take your head. So yeah, that's the legend that became the urban legend in Heads Will Roll. But I find something about those sorts of stories. I find it interesting to interrogate the root of those stories and what the actual reality of them is or was. What's the truth behind the lie, essentially. And so that's definitely something that I had fun playing with as I was redrafting the book.
I think it's really interesting because as you were speaking, I sort of noticed that so many of our urban legends, especially the ones that get used in horror literature or film are about victims who become monsters then, you know?
Yeah.
How they are in a way also, even though they are themselves monsters and they're usually threatening or the main characters or the status quo or what have you, they're also righteous.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah. I've always got a soft spot for like an anti-hero or like somebody, I guess it's like an element of queerness, like somebody who's misunderstood. I don't think that I've thought too deeply about why that is, but I do think that probably growing up as a closeted gay kid, you're very aware of the fact that you are sort of implicitly othered by the majority around you, and that you could very easily be branded a monster and dangerous. So that probably is the underlying psychology to that, but I actually hadn't really thought about it until this very moment. So who knows?
And in a way, it also mirrors what Willow is going through too, because again, it is very ambiguous, and the reader really can interpret what got her canceled. And also just looking at her story in general, because you do learn a lot about her and her background. She, in a way, went through that transformation too.
Yeah, completely. And I think that Hollywood has kind of become the playground of urban legends. They just happen to be about movie stars and directors. And that is kind of a vein that is running through my books, is this idea of the mythology of Hollywood. What are the myths that have risen up around certain productions or certain people? And are they deserving of that reputation? I think it's very easy to forget that these people may be famous and some of them may be incredibly wealthy, but at the end of the day, they are still regular human people. They still shit, cry, eat, laugh, just like everybody else does. So I find that also fascinating because it's interesting that some people can become an idea. If you say Meryl Streep, you don't necessarily think about the fantastic actor and what she's capable of. You just think of, you have an idea of this person that maybe doesn't bear any relation whatsoever to the human being who has been assigned that name.
It kind of reminds me of that Cary Grant quote where he's like, everybody wants to be Cary Grant, including me.
Right.
You know, how much actually worse that has gotten in the era, as Jessica was saying, where celebrities are encouraged to be a brand, and how it's kind of tragic that you actually have to like gleefully participate in your own dehumanization. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, completely. And I think that it's all about presenting a sort of acceptable or like an easy product, I guess, in a lot of ways. You know, you kind of become a product as soon as you're making movies that people are going to pay tickets to go and see, or you're writing books that people are going to buy. You kind of do become a product. For me personally, seeing my name on a book, I have a very dissociative sort of relationship to that, where I look at that name and it's sort of like, well, it kind of looks like my name, but it's bizarre to see it on a book. So I think branding has become sort of a bit of like a great evil in a lot of ways, because it's so reliant on reducing yourself to that one specific thing that everybody knows you for. And don't you dare try to do anything different, which I guess ties in with the idea of Willow being a horror fan who just wants to star in horror films, but she's been stuck in sitcoms. Don't even try to get out of that because you're just going to confuse people. And who wants to be confused?
To be fair, going back to urban legend, the main actor in that was the Noxzema girl. I'm trying to remember, her name was
Shall I tell you? It's
uh
Rebecca Gayheart.
Rebecca Gayheart, right. So Rebecca Gayheart was known as the Noxzema girl for the
Yeah.
longest time. It was like she didn't have her own name, and then she was in urban legend, and I think a lot of people did have trouble or struggle separating her from being the Noxzema girl when they saw that movie, if I recall, when that movie came out. So
They even made a
it
joke
is
about it in the film.
yes, it has been forever. So thank you for
Yeah.
reminding me. So yeah, for sure.
And it's actually similarly with Joshua Jackson in that film. He was riding high on Dawson's Creek. I think
He
he
was
was maybe,
Pacey.
he was Pacey.
He was Pacey. Yes.
I think he even has his blonde, like, do you guys call it frosted tips? He had like his blonde hair dye from season 2, I think, of Dawson's Creek. And you just can't not address the Dawson in the room. So that's why they have him put the radio on and I don't want to wait comes over the stereo. It's like, you just can't not address that stuff now.
Man, that was such a very specific time in
Oh
entertainment,
yeah.
was it not? Kind of getting back to it though, I just want to throw in, just because it made me really happy, and I don't want to tell the listeners what it is, but you probably will know what it is. You have one of my favorite Neverending Story quotes in this book. You know what it is,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, completely.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can talk about it off
Off air.
recording, but by Patricia Hayes, who is also in Willow,
Yes. Yeah.
Willow, the feature film with Warwick Davis. But
Yeah, I just felt
yeah,
there are a couple of moments in Heads Will Roll where I'm calling back to The Shadow Glass, which was my first book, and it was like an 80s puppet fantasy love letter that was very much inspired by Jim Henson and Labyrinth and the Neverending Story. And with Burn the Negative, which was my first book after that, I think with Burn the Negative, that was the book that I wrote during lockdown. So that would have been 2021, I think. And I love that book. I love so much about it. But I think it kind of was a bit of a downer in the end. I think it probably was a symptom of the lockdown that we were going through. And with Heads Will Roll, I really wanted to get back to this more of an uplifting sense of horror, if that's a thing, and sort of like really trying to celebrate the things I love. Like When the Negative was celebrating all my love for 90s horror films, but with Heads Will Roll, I wanted to get more back to like the queerness that I love so much. And yeah, so there's various little callbacks to Shadowglass in Heads Will Roll that hopefully people enjoy.
I am glad that you brought up this sort of hopefulness, because I think actually a word I kept thinking about was hope punk, like where it's like edgy and raw and also disturbing sometimes, but there is a hopeful core to it.
That's so great. I love that hope punk. I'm going to use that. Yeah, I think I can't really explain it. I think it just sort of came out in the writing where I wanted to write a hopeful queer story, and that's kind of what this ended up being. I think that Burn the Negative went to some really dark places that it was quite difficult to write a lot of that book in terms of the darkness of some of those characters. And with Heads Will Roll, I really wanted to embrace hope again. And I think it sounds like that comes through. I was surprised actually when the first reviews came through for Heads Will Roll, where they called it surprisingly upbeat and hopeful. Then I was like, oh, right, yeah. I think I really was trying to lean into that when I was writing it, because I find it really frustrating when I'm watching stories about queer people and there's tragedy related to their queerness. And there is tragedy in Heads Will Roll, but I think that so many queer stories tend to get bogged down in the tragedy, and there isn't enough room for hope in those stories. And so I was really trying to write something that was queer and hopeful. That's what it was.
I love this book. I really, really did. In fact, I don't know if you have read Chuck Tingle's Bury Your Gaze yet.
Yes.
I was telling Jen I call this book a kindred spirit, or a cousin to it.
Oh, that's amazing.
And because we just interviewed Chuck a few weeks ago, and that book was phenomenal. And then
Yeah.
reading this one after that one, it just sort of like felt like this nice breath of air. And while they are very different books, there are threads that come up in both of them that really made me feel like this was a good summer for them both to come out at the same time, because they are, in a way, they are kindred spirits. And I really don't necessarily want to say why specifically, because once again, I really would like listeners to read both books. They are both good. But I do think that when you're reading certain books about queer horror in general, or a queer horror book, there are certain threads that can be very nuanced. And while, like I said, in many ways these books are miles apart, they really are just kindred spirits. And I loved this one. This was so good, Josh. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you. I find Chuck Tingle so inspiring. I was on a virtual panel with him earlier this year, like a Chilling Thrillers panel for the Library Journal, and he was great. And then I actually bumped into him in person because I was at StokerCon this year, and I bumped into him in the bathroom when I had just come out of a cubicle. There was a massive line out the door to get to the urinals, and Chuck was in line to use the urinals, and I was just like, "Ah, Chuck! Oh, hi! Nice to meet you. This is like weirdly awkward, but I love you." And So that was my one in-person encounter with Chuck, sadly. But I find him hugely inspiring. I think that his message of love and acceptance in the queer community is just fantastic. And we need more people like Chuck Tingle. But obviously we have Chuck Tingle already, and he's freaking awesome. So yeah.
We need more people like Josh Winning.
Oh, thank you. I'll take that. Okay.
Another just like a little statement related to that. I do think that having hopeful literature is important, especially without getting too bogged down in the real world. It's very easy to lean into nihilism these days, I feel like. And so sources of hope are sort of really important.
Yeah. And like you can have hope even if there's an axe murderer on the loose. You know, you can find that silver lining. It's possible.
So are you working on anything upcoming?
I am. I'm working on two things right now. I'm juggling them both, and they're both projects I'm really, really excited about. I can't really talk about them, but one is, can I even say that? I don't know if I can. Well, the one that I'm currently working on is just a spec book that I'm not contracted for, and that's a YA project that is super queer, action-packed, and it's got sort of like small town 90s vibes, a little bit of Twin Peaks, maybe a little bit of Veronica Mars. Obviously, she's more 2000s, but so that's what I'm currently working on. And then there's another book that I am contracted for that I don't think I'm allowed to speak about, but I'm very, very excited to talk about that, hopefully next year.
Hopefully with us.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to.
So I guess we will sign off. Once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast, and my amazing co-host was
Jen.
And our guest is one of our favorite, now repeat 3 times guests. Please sign off.
I'm Josh Winning. Thank you so much for having me again.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.